Okay, great. Right, in that case, we will make a formal start. And I will say good morning and thank you all very much for coming today to the Social Life Foundation. If we haven't met yet, I'm James Turtle. I'm the director of the SNF. We're very pleased to be doing this event today with our friends from the Nuffield Politics Research Centre. I'll just do a quick bit of housekeeping before handing over if you actually want to listen to today. I think the main thing I'm going to tell you is that there's no fire alarm planned for this morning. So in the event that people start talking about fires, just head that way out the door. The other thing is that camera is currently, hopefully, someone will confirm this. We are YouTubing, as the young people say. So the event is obviously both in this room, but also going out to YouTube live, and will stay there on the SNF YouTube channel afterwards. So just bear that in mind when we get to the questions and conversational bit of the event, that you're not just talking to the people in the room, you're also talking to our vast thousands of YouTube followers. Actually, these things you laugh. They get it's not as big a TV audience as James used to, but it's we do get a modest following online. So that's the I think those are the main bits of housekeeping. We haven't got a hashtag. We're not doing anything of that. Okay, well, if you do feel no one tweets anymore, do they? No, we've given a tweeting, so we don't do hashtags anymore. In terms of running order, in a second I will hand over to Alex and Jane Green, who will talk you through their excellent paper, which I think is now online published. Yes, essentially this is, as you'll hear in a second, this is a Herculean task of scholarship, condensing down the amassed learning of dozens, thousands of scholars over many years of work into a paper of around 40 pages. We've then brutally squashed it down into one A4 sheet, which you've got a copy of. I may even ask everyone, be unkind later on, ask Alex and Jane to try and condense it down into a tweet, just for modern social media fun. So we'll hear from Jane and Alex, and then we'll get some responses and thoughts from our other learned panelists, Miranda and Chris. I'm not doing extensive introductions for everyone, because A, you know who they are, because you can read, and B, they can tell you which of their many qualifications they think are most relevant to the event this morning when they speak. So and that's about all. I was have I gone over time yet, Andrew? How you do? No, right. I'm told I'm about on time, so I need to either turn off the microphone, hand over the microphone. I'm going to hand over the microphone to Jane and Alex for their summary of the research. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, James. I'm just going to introduce this piece of work in a few ways. We're making a few points, and then I'm going to hand over to Alex, who's going to take us through the nuts and bolts, the real meat of what we've tried to do here. The first thing I want to say is thank you to the Social Market Foundation, who we thought there was just nobody better to host something. What we wanted to do with these pieces of works is the first of 5, a series of 5. What we wanted to do with these pieces of work was enable the translation of academic research into the real world for those people who are thinking about politics, who are thinking about public attitudes, and in particular, for this particular review, who are thinking about what might the implications be of this moment in which we find ourselves, this cost of living crisis. How might that change things? How might that change the landscape and the context in which policymakers, charities, campaigners, and others interested in these questions need to operate? And something as massive as this cost of living crisis, which has affected everybody, is kind of our first thought would be, well, obviously that's going to leave some kind of mark on public attitudes. And if it does leave an indelible mark on public attitudes, that might mean the governments need to do more, or governments need to change what they do, or it might just essentially change public demand for responses to people becoming poorer. So this is the topic that we want to address today. And as I said, this is the first of 5 systematic reviews. It's authored by Alex Yeandle, by myself and Tiffen Lecour, who's here, from all of us from the Nuffield Politics Research Centre. Alex is also at the OSC, but we didn't mention that part as well. Sadly, no, but we've all been working at Nuffield on this. In fact, we've been working on this for a couple of years. So this does represent quite a lot of work from us, and we're really delighted to be able to hopefully summarise it in a sort of translatable, accessible way for you today. So I'm going to just briefly touch on 3 questions. The first is, why did we do this? So it's not the thing I've been doing for a while. It's actually, you know, some of my colleagues who know me better, I've been spending several years now releasing new findings in electoral politics and public attitudes and public opinion, and that's what I've been doing. So why did we kind of attempt to engage in this systematic review of the literature? Well, the primary motivation is that, frankly, there are just, you know, decades of research papers and books that are written on these topics, but it's pretty inaccessible if you're not inside academia. And one of the reasons for that is that they're just paywalls. I mean, it's just really expensive to get your hands on all of the published research, and that's a debate for another day. But you know, that means it's really difficult for people that really need to have access to this research to be able to use it. I think the second thing that's really difficult is, how do you see the wood for the trees? I mean, you might hear me talking about, well, here's a thing I want to tell you about British elections or the British electorate. But how do you make sense of how that fits into the bigger picture? You know, what are the broad contours? What do we know? What does the research tell us? What do we think on the basis of years and years of research? What do we actually know about these topics? And it seems to me really quite sad that that isn't accessible to those people who are on the ground doing the work and basically impacting on people's everyday lives. And so we wanted to try to bring that research out on a topical question on something that really is important, which is the cost of living crisis and what kind of impact that might have on public attitudes. So we, as I said, we worked for a couple of years. We've had various back and forths on this particular topic, and we've also had the benefit of some other scholars looking at this work to make sure that it's not just our thoughts about it, but it's also chimes with kind of what the leading lights say on this particular topic. So what we want to do is to provide a kind of bird's eye view, if you like, of this particular literature. So this is our assessment of what this literature tells us about that question. So how do income shocks change people's demand for redistribution? In fact, do they change people's demand for redistribution? And if they don't, why don't they? So that's the first question I wanted to address, which is, why did we do this? And the second question I wanted to address is, okay, so we've done this. So what are the lessons or the implications? What are the insights? And Alex is going to go into much more detail about this. But in terms of the immediate implications, the first implication that we think we can draw from all of the research that we've reviewed, and it's over 100 books and articles that we've selected as being the really key books and articles that really are the most important and instructive. The first implication is that we don't think this cost of living crisis will necessarily impact on public attitudes in the round, as we might have expected. In fact, what we think, there'll be a lot of variability in how people respond, and Alex is going to take us through the 5 factors that are really important to understand what that variability is. But there are 2 important things that we might want to keep an eye on in terms of politics and in terms of the agenda over the coming months and years. One of the really important factors that we should keep an eye on in terms of moving public attitudes is, do people think things are going to get better? So, and that's not necessarily just for the country, but it's also for their own personal finances. And one of the reasons that's really important is, if you have a sense that it's, yes, this is rubbish, I don't like this particular moment, I wish it were different, but actually in the long run I think I'm going to be okay, then that's going to make a big difference, or an important difference, a significant difference to your attitudes around demand for what the state should do. And if we think about kind of the narrative around this particular moment, if indeed the public starts to understand that this is going to impact people's financial circumstances for a very long time, and perhaps benchmark that against other countries, then that could indeed be very important for the demand of what the government or what the state should do. The second thing to keep an eye on is whether the government and others really address broad beneficiaries of government intervention. So one of the things that's been really fascinating over recent years is two really big interventions, the furlough scheme and also energy payments, have essentially benefited a very broad segment of the population, not just those who started off on the very lowest incomes. Now, if that continues to be the case, it might indeed lead to broader support for public intervention than if the beneficiaries were narrowed down. And that has there are other implications of that too, around stigmatization of those people that benefit from government spending. So that's the second question, what were the implications? And then the third question I wanted to address was, what might policymakers, charities, campaigners, politicians, and what are the lessons that we might take away from this if you're looking to develop policies and also looking to garner broad public support for those policies? So we think there are three lessons. So one lesson would be try to keep the beneficiaries, or at least the indirect beneficiaries, if not the direct beneficiaries, as broad as possible, to maintain public support and also to avoid stigmatization of recipient groups. So that would be the first thing, based on the research, is our takeaway, one of the conclusions that we draw from what we've read and what we've understood. The second lesson that we also think is important is the trust amongst the poorest groups for government intervention benefiting them. And so trust around is very important for access and very important for confidence that the state will indeed support the poorest groups when people are on their when people are very vulnerable. And the third lesson is, one of the things that we concluded from our assessment of the research is that implementing solutions quickly seems to be important, given the importance or the relevance of that sense that there might be broader support when people think they might be the beneficiaries or they might need to be the beneficiaries, but when that starts to abate, public support might weaken over time. So if you want to do something, do it fast when public support is at its highest. So Alex is going to go into much more of the detail now and draw out the kind of 5 key themes from this research. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Jane. So the way in which we've structured this review is really to try to explain a central puzzle, and that puzzle is that different types of people might respond differently to a shock to their income that is broadly comparable. So we might pick any 2 given people out from the population. They might have a very similar shock to their income, but their attitudes might then respond in different ways. And it's really important for the government to understand the origins of those differences, because ultimately the government has to create policy that has public buy-in, otherwise it's just not sustainable in any sort of long-run setting. We think that the current cost of living crisis is a particularly relevant time at which to ask these questions, because unlike previous crises, the scope, the extent of the current crisis is very deep, and that different people will be impacted to different extents, but the amount of people that have been affected, at least in some way, is incredibly high. The current sort of period over the last couple of years has seen the most rapid decline in living standards since the 1950s, and even people who previously would be very much middle income, middle class, comfortable, have at least the perception that there's been a hit to their household finances. So understanding the origins of why people might respond in these different ways is really important. So when we break down the literature and try to ask these questions of individuals and why people might respond differently, we arrive at 5 key answers. And we think that these can be grouped into 2 separate clusters, if you like. There's a cluster of questions that relate to somebody's very material, very financial cost benefit calculation, whether I think my wallet is going to be better off or worse off as a result of a particular government policy or government action. And there's a batch of questions that are not so much about my financial well-being directly, but more about the way in which I think about altruism, the way in which I think about other groups of people and who deserves to benefit or not. And so running through those first questions, which are focused on cost-benefit calculations, the very first thing that matters and that comes out in the literature in this very early work is the idea that your income right now your sort of present income, if you want to call it that, is a very important starting point. And we don't think this explains everything, but at least to begin with, your income now matters for the extent to which you could weather a shock, and it matters for the extent to which what you put into the system through taxation and what you get back out of the system in government spending, how that trade-off takes place. And the very simple assumption, which does find some empirical support, is that clearly if you're richer, you're going to be less supportive of government spending going up because you think you'll be the one that has to pay for it. And if you're poorer, the opposite is true. You think you won't be paying, but you'll be benefiting. So it's a very narrow, sort of self-interested way of thinking about the world. And we think there's a lot more flesh to be added to that, but it's useful as a framework, as a starting point. But there are two important ways in which we think this can be nuanced. So this leads us to our second question, which is about people's expectations. And rather than thinking just about what your income is today, clearly people have some idea, some estimate of how their income is going to change over the coming years, over the course of their life. And the implication here is that if you expect you're going to see your income rise significantly in the future, then that's going to alter your behavior now, because it doesn't make sense to support huge tax rises now if you think this time next year you're going to be the one paying for them. And vice versa, if you have high income now, but you expect that income is going to rapidly drop off, it makes sense for you to support a more generous public spending form of welfare state. And just to really put some examples on this, we can think of long and short-term reasons why somebody might expect their income to rapidly change. In the very short term, we might look at people working in the gig economy. We might look at people who have a lot of uncertainty about what their income is going to be in the future. People perhaps who are on fixed-term contracts versus permanent contracts. People who are not sure how long they're going to be employed for, and that will condition them to think in a longer-term view rather than just the money they have coming in right now. We might also think about more system-level changes in the structure of the economy itself. So we might look at challenges posed by automation. A lot of people who feel that their economic value is going to go down in the future as a result of that. We might even think of people, for instance, university students whose income while they're university students is incredibly low, but who expect to go on to do different types of corporate private sector jobs that will, in the quite near future, pay very well. So it's important, we think, to consider people's longer term prospects and their perceptions of those as well. And lastly, and I guess this dovetails from the idea of expectations about income, is the idea about how much people actually see themselves as beneficiaries of government policy. And we think this particularly applies to lower income individuals and lower income households, that there are a lot of government spending programs that on paper are very targeted, are very means tested, are designed to help particular groups of people who are those who are most in need. But actually, when you go around trying to get access to those services, the bureaucratic hurdles, the paperwork, the waiting times, the general sort of standoffishness and assumption of wrongdoing in that process often makes it very difficult. And there are countless examples of this. One of the more recent examples is the high level of documentary proof needed to claim things like disability support payments, needed to claim unemployment benefits, and documenting that you're searching for work and things like this. And so we think it's very important not just to think about somebody's income now, but also to think about whether somebody thinks if the government commits to spending more on a redistributive public policy, whether they will actually benefit from it in real life rather than just benefiting from it on paper. And so from here, we move away slightly from these previous sets of questions, which, as you can see, very much think about a more narrow sort of rational material self-interest, whether or not I'm going to personally become better or worse off in a financial setting because of the balance of taxation and spending in the economy. Because we think there are still some empirical regularities that are puzzling. There are still a lot of poor people who do not support increased public spending, and there are still a lot of wealthier people who are very enthusiastic about the government doing more, about the welfare state being expanded, and potentially about that taxation, not just in the short run, but even in the long run, going up, that don't quite fit these questions that we've addressed so far. And we think the first question that stems from this is to ask what somebody's baseline level of support is. And we think that there's a lot of work that looks at people's experiences of being socialized into politics. And broadly speaking, what this means is the type of environment somebody grew up in, the type of environment somebody found themselves in when they started thinking and learning about political questions and really developing political attitudes for the first time. And there's a lot of evidence that the income of people's parents and also the state of the economy when somebody first enters the labour market, so when you're in your early 20s, can really have a long-lasting impact throughout your life on how you respond to later shocks. And the argument for this is that people's starting level of preference changes. So it might well be that if you grow up in a poorer household, your baseline preference for government redistribution is a lot higher, and as a result, it takes a lot more to make that shift than it would for somebody who starts off, say, from the middle or from a lower down point. And I guess this speaks to this old adage that in the UK, you can predict somebody's politics, at least in parts, at least historically, from the politics of your family. And that's not always true, but there's a lot of evidence that it not necessarily how you vote, but at least how you respond in attitudinal terms to an income shock, that this childhood experience really matters. And our final question is to then look at more moral dimensions of what government spending is, and more profoundly, who we think deserves to benefit from it, whether taxation is something that is right or wrong, whether government assistance for people is something that is right or wrong, and how that changes the balance of this calculation that is being made. And there's a lot of work that looks at different types of social group, and these vary a lot from one society to another, be it the UK, the US, other parts of Europe. But the idea quite broadly is that for a variety of reasons, there are some groups in society who are seen to deserve to benefit, and there are some groups in society who don't deserve to benefit. And we think that understanding how any one given individual is going to respond to a cost of living crisis that affects them themselves is really going to be conditioned by how they think about other people and other groups in society. There's a lot of evidence that rhetoric used by politicians, by the mass media really matters here. So in the UK, there's a lot of literature that looks at class and this idea of benefit scroungers, or the so-called sort of demonization of welfare, and that this can really matter because it shifts the perception that people on a lower income, or the working class people who claim benefits, somehow don't deserve to be claiming that. And that can affect perceptions of government spending even among people who are low income themselves, and introduce a sense of guilt about wanting to claim things. So again, it falls outside of what we would expect under this very narrow income-based set of questions. There's also a lot of evidence, particularly in the US and in some other parts of Europe, that this correlates with questions about race, questions about immigration, attitudes towards asylum seekers. It's no coincidence, perhaps, that a lot of populist radical right parties in Europe advocate a form of welfare chauvinism, advocating really generous redistributive support, but making sure that none of it goes to people who are from another country. So bringing all these 5 questions together, we think there are a handful of interesting implications that can be drawn from the literature widely and from our report in particular. We think the most important thing to take away is that public opinion is not a homogenous block, that it's not going to